And at first it showed 205 something. I'm like, wow, am I down, I guess, 8+ pounds? But then I hopped back on and it showed a 206. I got the oven on because it is cold. And I had a good long month, real long month of just going from training really intensely and focusing on my training. Of course, I was having some joint pains because I think I was just pushing the, it's not necessarily the weight movements, but it's a certain pattern of intensity at a certain angle, particularly if you have damage or injuries to certain areas, such as I do. The main issue has always been my right shoulder. But remarkably, when I'm doing lighter weight movements, not just lighter weight movements, but high repetitions. So my son got these dumbbells that are only 20 pounds, and it's the perfect fix. They're either 20 or 25. And they really seem to be doing the trick. So when I mess around with those a little bit, I mean, it seems like a given, right? You do your warm-ups. But once you can go through a fuller range of articulation, especially with a damaged circumductive junction point like the shoulder or the hip. So when I got in the mirror, a full-length mirror not even 2 years ago, it was like a little over, maybe about a year and a half ago, my jaw dropped. Not in a good way. It was the first time where I looked in the mirror and I looked like a concentration camp, not even a survivor. I'd never seen that before in my thighs, because I was doing all the aerobic walking, well over 2,000 miles. Like, it's just something I really enjoy, even if it's on hard tile, even if it's through grueling landscapes and seascapes. I love pushing myself and walking long distance. There's just nothing that even compares to it. Sometimes I'll have to walk for days at a time before I can really just like stretch out and get relaxed. But instantly, it helps me breathe. It helps me get focused, and that's what I'm doing right now. Is just going back into an all-day walk. So that's what GIT training is all about, is focusing in on mobilization and stabilization, lighter weights, but then trying to focus in on obviously like compound exercises, right, as well, for higher repetitions that are broken into like circuits that are based on perceived exertion. So in other words, if I don't feel like lifting at all one day, I don't. My body will prompt me. I love lifting weights. I love resistance training. But there is a point where you just feel top heavy. You know, you become asymmetrical. And so most people, there's a point where they will sacrifice their philosophical and principle base as a human being, or just an entity in the universe, right? Which you don't see animals do. It's like, it's so hard wired into them that they go down with the ship every time. A dog will just continue to bark typically when they haven't been domesticated, and domestication happens much more rapidly than most people think. I may have even posted up, I think that was on 2 other channels that I posted this up, but I think I'll put it up here because it's very relevant. Has to do with this, I think that they were coyotes. See, they seem to be, they were pups. They were, I think they were coyote pups. I could have that wrong. I don't think they were wolf pups. But these scientists, right, trying to mark some research, they simply walked up to these wild animals, let's just say, for lack of a better, and charted how close they could get before the animal instinctively began to growl and, show aggression. And they charted that down. And they bred the pups that did that later. The ones that were just simply more docile, the ones that gave them an extra inch or two. And in a very short time frame, right, of just like 3 to 10 years, they began to take on characteristics that would be more charted as feminine features. So they began to get floppy ears. They began to get little white patches on them, right? So what does this sound like? It's very much like the mouse utopia. So keeping the aggression alive is a misconnotation, a misnomer, right? It's a balance. So it's knowing when to unleash this aggression and how much should come out at any given time out of that spigot, so to speak. But to stay hard, to stay solid, to stay strong while you go on your journey. And that is walking or cycling. If you've got so with cycling, it's like I used to see people back in the day when I was way into cycling, and I intentionally wouldn't go on super long trips because I knew I'd have to replace my tire. Like anything, if you repetitively do anything like 45 miles over and over again repetitively, after a few days, you're replacing that tire. So I remember seeing people that I'd see out in this riding in the same areas. I used to love road biking around Pebble Beach and then going toward the valleys or even especially up north of the Monterey Bay. Great hills, great hill climbing. But it's been many years. And it's hard to keep up on that, But they would ride with a fully loaded bike rim that had a nice fresh tube in it, just because they knew that's what's going to happen, right? They didn't want to deal with having to change the thing out mid-ride. So they just had anticipated it and carried along a full-on wheel rim with a fresh tube. And I would say that that's even a good example of an approach that you take when you're, like for me, I know that if I don't start walking right when I wake up, chances are I'm not going to throughout the day. It really makes a big difference what you begin with, what you start out with. And even if you have a little bit of sunlight to get those aromatic amino acids in your ocular centers to produce that bioluminescence that has been looked at as the center of human consciousness, probably because it feels like a storm because it is a storm. It literally is like this storm of electron cloud potential. But I would love to train for size, but I just can't. I'm 56. I don't take testosterone. I don't do any of those things that'll bolster. And it really is about your bones and your ligaments, tendons, fascia, the things that you start losing pretty rapidly. I even stepped off the creatine and the trimethylglycine. I think I still have a good fair amount that would probably last me a good solid month. And so I'm going to kind of save that for down the road. I guess my whole point to that little talk about cycling has more to do with the fact that your legs don't shrink up first, right? What you see with cyclists who are doing similar types of diets and nutrition, right, i.e. carnivore or going on high protein gluconeogenic diet plans, is that their upper bodies shrink considerably. And as long as you're lean in society, that has always been an aesthetic acceptance. Oh, you just have a smaller sort of upper body, right? But wherever the blood flow patterns are going on a regular basis, right? I think probably if you've looked them up, Durian Ryder is a good example of that, right? You got somebody who pitches the whole IGF high sugar diet and has been doing it for many years and doesn't worry about nutrients. And then when somebody calls him out on it, he shows that, I take in this vegetable or, right? But what's happening is just a complete centric focus on 85% high octane carbohydrates, often in the form of sugars. But the caveat that people don't see is that he's riding his bike all day. It takes all day riding, just like it takes all day walking. For the longest time, when you look at muscle and fitness and you don't realize that there's a delineation there where there's no way in heck. And I remember doing this when I was like 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, trying to put together the perfect training plan and realizing over and over again, there's something missing here, right? And that something is the steroids, but it's not just steroids, it's just PEDs. A lot of people think, oh, you just do a steroid and that equals this, but you have to go into this entire, there's a Arimidex and Nolvadex and many other things that have to be taken, even Proviron as support, and then going through proper PCT cycles, right? Where you don't just, you have to think about your levels, right? Between testosterone, estrogen, estradiol, and then how that affects like progesterone and other things that do happen, i.e. man boobs. So you start taking on these characteristic. What's that? Neonetic, or it's when people have these characteristics of children, right? So it kind of gets into that study that we were just talking about moments ago, where you can see how quickly the mouse utopia, or what they call the beautiful ones, right, begin to emerge. How quickly a society begins to show signs of breakdown, right? There's a misconnotation of basic basal subsets of the limbic system, the amygdala, the medulla oblongata, as the funny phrases in the water boy or whatever that was, and the caudate patanum, right? What drives that, right? And when you get into this higher stage of thinking, it's not even the neocortex that's driving it. It's this phenomenon as an event of will and willpower, right? And even though you enjoy reading philosophy, like Nietzsche, right? At that point, that is going to sort of push you toward this Promethean flame concept, right? And that is your taste, that is your flavor. You don't need that philosophy to support the motivation. The motivation comes from movement itself, from the movement patterns. So much so that I'd say it seems like an odd next step, but you get into neurolinguistic programming because for those who are having ocular issues, try closing your eyes and sort of doing this circular sweep around with your eyes, and you'll reach a certain spot, right? And you'll go, oh, that's to the right. That's where my eyes bother me the most, or where those ocular muscles, out of those 8 basics, that's where there's a weakness, you know? And the reason that is because you're evading looking in a particular direction. And when you do, you'll see this mind interface, if you will, through this temporal mechanism of time, distance, but left, right paradigms. Like when you're looking down, when you see somebody talking and they're looking down to their lower left, they aren't necessarily lying, but it really depends on the subject that's being talked about, because it's this creative, imagined. So when they're talking about things in a factual sense and they're looking down to their left, you're talking about somebody who, in their own paracosm, sociopathic paracosm, they are wired to lie, right? Then you have to get into the intricacies of whether or not they wired themselves or were co-efficiently, right, to stay alive, wired in such a way, like to where there was a reward mechanism in a very toxic household that passes this on through familiar lines, almost like familiar spirits, as they say. Because, so this gets into a whole nother area, but I want to finish with that, is that even when you look in a certain direction, that is, you don't even have to have your eyes open, right? And when you look down into the lower right, typically you're trying to reflect back and remember items and issues, right? Trying to itemize, you're trying to recall. And of course, people who incur damage to certain areas of their brain, nervous system, and go through traumatic events are going to react in ways that end up showing up through this morphic resonance, if you will, through a broad macro view. And so this all leads into and espouses to many of the things, the claims that Dr. Michael Levin is talking about in his research that I knew would get broad when I started to post things that he had to say on theories of everything with Kurt J. Mungle, and really go into these deeper intricacies of LLMs, large language models. He hadn't even began to necessarily talk about it, or at least I wasn't exposed to it, but I could see what was coming next, like not in some prescient or clairvoyant way. You see how this is a scientist, you see how they're taking a certain thought application and that it follows through in such a way, right, to where there's a mimetic imprint or blueprint left behind that begins to manifest itself and make a lot of sense, but seems like complete nonsense to most people. And so that gets into these murmur patterns that are talked about with AI. And it gets into the fact that numbers themselves, like, I don't think he's said this outright, but he's in his more recent interviews, like he's got a great interview on Lex Friedman. And then there's another one that goes back a few years, right? So you can kind of look at those two lengthy interviews. This last one was like 3 hours, so it's amazing. I haven't watched through the whole thing, but it is to say that, like the whole poem that went around, not to be tacky, around the Bay Area, and then kind of swept around globally was, this is just to say, right? Well, this is just to say that numbers in themselves create a dynamic of a consciousness to where I don't think we're far from people like Dr. Michael Levin saying, guess what? If on a microscalable level, if these anthrobots and these xenobots have agency, can say, well, how can you prove that they don't have agency when the form is changed? So there's, if you get into the just general study of this, is these frog embryo cells, right? I've seen him using bullfrog embryo cells and then other frogs, right? But the important thing is that these xenobots, right? And it's a really poor term, and he's even kind of stated that. But when you blank slate any sort of conscious movement, right? Even on such a micro scalable level, right? Where you're talking about having to look through a microscope to witness this, that there is a complete and total breakoff from the original cell pattern just by, from his own, paraphrasing his own words from years back, giving appendages or taking, really, it's not about taking anything away, but changing the shape. Like, so what he'd do is he'd just go in there and kind of work around and sort of give them appendage, give them, and just change their form. And he watched them completely break off from their original deterministic, syllogistic cellular track, right? Of sort of whether or not it was remodeling and repair or whatnot, right? So we're going through some form of genesis as a collective with other cell structures or cell bodies. And he saw that there was an aberrant break-off of behavior. But when you look at something that could be looked at least from our perspective, through a microscope as a very simple life form, right? Which I don't think anything is simple. The deeper we go in and start to see that there's ever smaller units that most likely go beyond the Planck wall, right? Where halving can no longer take place. And it's like, that's because it doesn't go into halving anymore. It goes into number systems and number theory that's coming out now in a remarkable way, where exactly what I'm talking about is you're looking at the dynamics of these, what we would see as numbers, but what are you really ever counting? Like, where does the number come from, in other words? How can you be so absolute? This has been something that's debated for the long, and you could just take a simple, concrete but suggested notion, like looking at phi or phi, or really the Fibonacci sequence, the whole golden mean standard, and going, okay, we begin with this sort of John Dee-esque sort of monad that is the zero, right? And whether or not we can call this a zero. So you have 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, right? 144, and so on, right? Just so you understand what I'm talking about. And there's this sequential aspect that exists here that wouldn't exist if you hadn't have first counted literally the first principle, the first step, the first movement. You wouldn't go anywhere if the zero in itself was actually not a zero. It appeared to be a zero, a Phoenician, Babylonian sort of zero, right? Where you're beginning to look at this and going, no, this is complete, right? So it gets into the areas of integer, right? Integrity, right? What comes first? So why would it changes the whole number sequence in the number system, you see? Because you have something that's disparately compartmentalized and separate to where numbers themselves can't be quantified back to the original source. And to me, it shows a lot of the concepts that are being played around with today with regards to the fact that many of the top leading physicists, astrophysicists, a lot of times there's not much, when we talk about ambiguity, there's not much difference between these fields these days at the top level of this research, it seems. For instance, you got Penrose, who recently was in an interview talking, just in the past few years, he's suggested this a few times, where it's like he should have never got into the areas of consciousness, right? Just like Linus Pauling would probably say that maybe him championing very similar attributes, because really what he was doing with his studies and proclamation with high dose vitamin C, not really fully understanding, but seeing this effect in himself, which is what I'm doing right now, which is, you go into gluconeogenesis, you have this cortisol effect, you're not taking in any carbohydrates, you're coming out of slow wave sleep cycle through these troughs, right? So there's a big deception occurring today in form of peptides. So the deception wasn't even just about hushing Linus Pauling so that Big Pharma could go in and do the damage that it did, that really turned toward the IOB, the Internet of Bodies, and has gone into many other areas by these covert clandestine groups that really are doing a very sort of Nazi SS. They looked at the pattern, in other words. It was already set in stone, you may say, depending on the direction that you chose, the first step that you take, if that makes sense, in this sequence, the mimetic sequence of the numbers through behavior models. Just like what I was talking about, is instead of choosing the most vicious, so in the time of war, if you want a war dog, you're going to choose the one who snarls and growls the most, and there's going to be that aggression to not break the dog, but to befriend the dog in such a way that the animalistic, the pure primal aspect knows that it needs you for food and survival, but if you get too close, it'll tear you apart. And so they would want to keep that sort of war dog, right, mentality going. Whereas in a society such as this, where little cupcakes and compartmentalized units of measure, something looks cute, we're going to choose that, until you have something that's essentially just dysfunctional to the point where it no longer wants to procreate. And the entire society just dies away like the mouse utopia, right? But what if that entire process was a replay through the sequence of the number systems? It's the numbers. Don't forget that this number, through the field operations, you could get into Konrad Zuse, Alan Turing, as to say that this awareness of all these numbers. In fact, there's the weirdest, not that it's not always weird, but there was the weirdest Futurama on the other night that I watched with my son, that took this really crude depiction of this, but they stepped into the other side, this liminal space that we're discussing here. And they actually went into this place where where these numbers were conscious, right? So once this has reached that level, right, where it's being introduced subconsciously to the children watching Futurama, to the people who are, have been fans of Futurama for the long, right? But even more so, you look at Nancy Cartwright, playing Bart Simpson for 35 plus years, being a top Scientologist, and then looking at her family and other celebrities stemming from her family, and that this is a sort of planned operation of the process church, right? Then you're beginning to understand why and how certain positions, such as program killers, the Richard Ramirez connection to his uncle, having fought in Vietnam and being a part of a special unit that was breeding him to be a freaking psychopathic killer, and that he was, and that he responded to it in such a way that he kept the images. He murdered his wife right in front of Richard Ramirez, and blood actually got on Richard Ramirez. He was taken through an operation. Or the long form discussions with Charles Manson as a planned PSYOP operation, right, where the connections with him are insane. And if you really want to look into this, you'll look at the connection with Nicholas Schreck and Zena LeVay, his ex-spouse. But, you know, it just gets into whole other areas. Through a planned mimetic operation, where knowing that the numbers are dynamic, knowing that there are erotic number systems, looking from a cursory sort of outside perspective at your own birth date, the time that you were born, and to begin to look at things from that perspective, but to say this in itself is a complete cover-up, because when we go back and we look at the Julian calendar and we start to look at all these other calendar systems, that this doesn't make sense. This is not how people even kept time in different eras, right? That ironically, the only way to go back to those times is to use their formalized methodology of time itself. You have to get the charts out, right? You got to get out the compass and the square. You have to be able to gauge like these murmurs with the Gauss sequence. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that's how it's spelled. And Gauss in his youth came up with the Gauss sequence, which is counting numbers from, you can start with 0 to 101. So you're starting on the bottom and you're creating this vertical column and you're going up. And then you go back down in reverse. You start with 0, or actually chirality, right? But it shows a uniform aspect to where these two positions through the diagonal mechanism are equals 101, right? As you minus 1. So just looking at the system and looking at the subset of the diagonal mathematics. I believe at one time it was referred to as like Asinian mathematics, if I'm correct. So what I'm able to do as an INTJ through the Myers-Briggs, and I've never taken those Asher sort of tests, right? But you get my point, is that looking at things from a macro perspective, the mastermind, that is, all that really means, you're, from what I understand, is looking at things from an outside perspective. And jumping in where required, because you can kind of see it, but you're not necessarily involved with it. So as a so-called introvert with extroverted thinking, entirely extroverted thinking, an introvert with extroverted thinking. So that could go really smashingly good or really bad, right? Just in its suggestivity. So you begin to see how the form, the morphic resonance, the geometry, hailing back to the compass and the square, and why so much Rosicrucian artwork, Masonic artwork, looks to be this suggestion of, well, like Burns' organ. Burns' organ, right? And I can't remember how to pronounce it, but it's an underground lake that's barred off by the Masons, and there's a whole huge gate that was erected in 2019 that names all the people, owned by someone with the last name of Burns. And there's the Pillars of Rome up around the same area that sort of harkens back to this Tartarian inference. But again, just like flat Earth, they go into these psi operations where when I say they, there's people on Reddit. I mean, there's people in those inner circles of Red Panda Koala. When you get into that whole thing, you see that that's a mind F, because you have these sort of, on one side, you probably have a bunch of Zizians, right? Working in these sort of swept into these planned operations where you have these really high IQ, but very stochastically based, mathematically based, not just transsexuals, but just people that are working on this tier, right? That you could say are more mathematical than intellectual. and therefore are looking for their own intellect in an existentialist sort of supplementary way with this not community but collectivism with one another. And then you have on the very far right, what becomes much more obvious is that you have people like Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani, who I've always felt very compelling and brilliant, but I think the same thing of Michael Tessarian, if you're familiar with his work, where he's talking about the Promethean flame, about this intellectual need for the higher man. And you have to really get into Nietzsche and what is considered this Übermensch versus just merely the higher man. The higher man being, so if you were to take that example of, I can't remember, was it a coyote, a wolf? Like when they show the picture, I'll try to put it up so that you can see that, right? But, and I should be able to cite the doctor as well, but it was just like obviously a really brief short that I watched, but it was really packed with a lot of information. And obviously it was on a feed from a subscription that I have that deals with this type of stuff, this behavior model. But when you look at that, let's say coyote, for lack of a better on approach, and it growls, right? Well, you could say that that is, in essence, the higher man. Right, is that its senses are heightened, and if its senses are heightened and self-preservation becomes the key model, why? Right, so you look at the Promethean torch and you say, this is obviously passed down through, this is subjective, but it's true, through a paternal mechanism, right? That everything is against the man in society. Everything is against you be developing into a man. And if in one way, if you could preserve this and keep this flame alive, you're going to have to go through to result in this one item, this one symbol from a doxastic sense, right? That energy can be surmised into one symbol, but what that infers is so much pain, so much hardship, that you see this sort of natural, blue diamond that emerges that can't be created or recreated in a laboratory yet, right? To where it's virtually, literally, virtually indistinguishable from the natural pressurized mechanism that time and entropy and influence, right? Eras and repeats, and very disparate and intellectual notions that come out of this, right? So I'm getting a little lightheaded. I don't want to banter on, but there's definitely some food for thought there, and I'm going to continue on with my walk, thinking, conjecturing, but not spouting on and bleeding off all of my air, right? And I'll be able to breathe and go into this next challenge that I have through my day that's just getting started. So have a good one. We'll see you soon, and I'll be doing some videos based around exactly what I'm doing right now. So we've dropped 8 pounds. I'm going to go with 8 pounds because I haven't had any sort of bowel movement. Just took a quick leak in the morning and was down 8 pounds. Granted, that 213, really pushing closer toward 214 if I remember correctly. I think it was 213.6 or something. That was at night last week. Not even a week ago. And this is in the morning. But obviously I've dropped a few, right? That's why I even showed in that video that little short that I just posted up moments ago. And what is the date anyway? It's the, I suppose it's like the 5th or the 6th today. I haven't really been paying attention like I should be, but I think it's the 5th. So I'll be ordering some supplies in a few days, getting some bacon, some beef, mainly bacon and beef, some more heavy cream. You can see the results that I posted up just yesterday as well of where I was a year and a half ago. And I found it pertinent to bulk up a couple times since then. There's something that I was missing. Even though, I was attracted toward the beef liver and really bolstering my vitamin A, my copper, my iron levels, right? Because I think that when you drop that much weight and you're really eating a very protein-centric nutrition plan without eating any carbohydrates, right? And then I started to get into, admittedly, I was getting into, this gets into a whole nother area, but I was getting into drinking alcohol. I was really enjoying, I was like, I'm not eating any carbs. I don't enjoy it. I'm able to, yeah, that's a vicious cycle where you're eating. I mean, that's what essentially how these long-term alcoholics look. They're very lean. They don't touch carbohydrates. And the only thing that they want is alcohol. So I was getting into like old fashions and Manhattans and all sorts of interesting drinks that I was just enjoying, and I found some really good, high quality, good costing products that I think I even showed myself indulging in a video or two. I don't know if I kept them up. And then when I would go eat, it was like the best meal that I ever had, but it wasn't like I still wanted it, right? I just wanted to walk. I wanted to train, and it takes so much time to do that. So metabolic flexibility, in other words, has been the primary goal, to be able to bolster and build. And this comes down to seasonal eating. And so I went through this bulk cycle, and from my own pennation angle, my own muscle attachment, perceived maximal size, right? And what I find is even when I bulk up, I think I almost hit like 17.5-inch arms. And I knew that to go up to 18, it would be like, I'm going to have to start deadlifting, maybe putting a little bit, even more weight around the waist. And if I drop off too much, I'm going to be kind of this big blubbery fat gelatinous mess, which didn't really happen. What does end up happening is, if you really go deep into this, into the toxic aspects of this, where you're allowing yourself to just sort of rampantly be pulled along by and swept along by whatever comes your way, you'll notice that it's either alcohol or sugar, and particularly processed foods, right? So last night, when I was hungry, I just cooked up 6 eggs, right? So it's going to be, I left that off my list. It's going to be eggs, cheese, working the list backwards, sort of, heavy cream. And then, of course, we've got beef and bacon as some main staples. And just walking, so all day walking. I was amazed when I came out of walking, every day for an average of I think my average, even with taking time off, was just under 8 miles a day. So I'd have days where I would walk 20 or 25 miles. And it's amazing what you can get done with GIT training, gradual intensity training, RogueBeastWarrior style gradual intensity training, where you don't have an upper limit with the number of miles you're willing to walk. It's about time. But if you have the ability, if nobody's around and you're able to go into these walks and you can walk in the middle of the night, then you do that. Same with training. If you just feel prompted to get up really early and start training and lifting, and lifting is done in such a way where eventually you might do 8 to 10 sets, but your goal isn't to exhaust yourself and get away from training. The goal with GIT training is to be able to train throughout the day, right? So this is what I effectively came upon when I was professionally training people, where a lot of times the busier I got from a financial sense, from a community perspective of training other people, I only had 5 or 10 minutes, but I knew here and there for these micro workouts, they had to be intense. And what ended up happening is I'd have cancellations. So yeah, I'd end up having 2 or 3 hours in the day that I didn't anticipate prior to, right? And when I went into it, I realized, okay, it's pretty consistent here. This pattern is showing a consistency, right? Where at least 2 or 3 times a week, I had these cancellations and I was able to just effectively, and I never knew exactly who was going to cancel or what time it was, but it usually came down to people canceling around 2 p.m. And that was the time that worked the best for me for training, you know, anywhere between like 1 and sometimes noon. So you can almost say the bracket was like, say, 11 a.m. all the way up to like 3:30 p.m. It's like this 5-hour window. And the longer I would wait, it was really based on whether or not I was taking enough protein, because at that time I was completely in gluconeogenesis most of the time, where I would take in up to 750 grams of protein a day. Of course, protein quality has gone down considerably and changed. Now they're just straight out lying, not that they always weren't, but there's high concentrations of lead that they've found in protein powders. And maybe that is just because it's being looked at. Everything's being vetted, everything's being looked at through this micronized effort, right? On a minute scale. But that is where I'm at there. And I can't afford the supplements that I want to take in right now, but I would be taking in more citrulline, nitric oxide. I'd probably be even taking in taurine, and glutamine and taurine at certain times to boost up my glutamine levels. But then because of all this cancer talk and so forth, taurine works as an antagonist and sort of mitigates. So amino acids compete with one another and they can literally be shut off and turned back on, right? Based on preference. But that all of them have to be there, right? Because you've got to be able to assist the gut and the blood-brain barrier. And without glutamine, that's not going to happen. And magnesium is probably the most important. Then there's a lot of talk around Michael Levy and orthomolecular nutritional sciences that even get into not just high-dose vitamin C, but methylene blue that shows some remarkable studies. So now that I'm breathing a little hard, I can see that I'm going into a kind of a excess post-oxygen consumption state of mainly aerobics, but there's a lot of anaerobics involved because I'm also feeling my muscles from yesterday. And so instead of rambling on for no reason, I'm going to build that energy up as I go in and do another scoop of protein and stay in my protein fast and focus on building the energy up so I can do some sets. So look out for some great videos to come where I'll be training. I'll be going into this all-day training. And if I get lean enough, which I will, it's just a matter of time. You know, when you have the blueprint, when you can rely on the blueprint, and there's no odds and ends, there's no discussions of what works, what doesn't work. This is what works, and it's really always available. I mean, it's in the carnage, right? I mean, it shows us really from a physical sense who and what we are, because when you get into this area of eating nothing but meat and the fat that's on the meat, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? And that's what works for human beings. That's what works for everyone, particularly within a certain social demographic where you look at the docile aspect of not only the working beyond the plebeian, right? Going onto this highbrow effort, the vegan, the vegetarian that is able to, Hitler, right? That is able to understand this nutritional sciences and the self and the intuition to the point, but also having all the resources. And what that means is that you have to become this complete and total narcissist just to get what it is that you require without slaughtering an animal. So you're not living with the fact that you had to be this the aggression, the primal aggression toward this warrior perspective, right? And so there's more honesty and truth in the carnivore way of living, but the goal has always been, as a society, and this is the only way it works, as a society, we have to become vegan and vegetarian from a scientific perspective, where everything that is not animal byproduct related has to be superior to any cheaper method of an animal byproduct. So with that, I will see you in the next one.